Greetings, this is Cliff Ruby, the Nostalgic Catholic, with another story review. Books. I've got a few books to get through, but I decided to take a little visit down memory lane for myself and explore the first science fiction writer that I read as a very young person, probably a child practically. And it wasn't Asimov, it was Clarke. I was 10 years old when the 2001 Space Odyssey movie first came to the theaters. And I was already in love with starships and spaceships and stars and planets and exploration and alien beings and all the rest of it. So when I saw Star Trek advertised in 1966, shortly before they aired their first official regular episode, I was hooked from that, and I've been seeing that. And then when I learned of this movie, of course I had to see it as well. The movie leaves a lot of questions. It's designed to do that. It's like an art piece. That being the case, what you got to do, therefore, what you got to do is try to read the book, and that can kind of fill some of the gaps. So, as I said, this has got to be probably the first serious work of fiction, I think. I've written some fiction for young people, but this was the first thing that wasn't specifically tailored to preteen or children. It was an actual normal person book to read. 2001, A Space Odyssey. And this is the back of the hardcover. No, I did not have this hardcover copy when I read it. It was just the paperback current for the time, which from then until now I have lost track of it and sadly no longer have. But having this hardcover, which captures its original release as part of the whole set, which I can at least show most of it here, because you see there's multiple books by Arthur C. Clarke. There's the 2001 A Space Odyssey, then there'll be 2010 Odyssey 2, 2061 Odyssey 3, and I just recently discovered, because I hadn't been following Arthur Clarke much in my adult life, there's now even a fourth volume to this 3001, which I don't even haven't read. So I do hope to have a chance to review these books. Don't hold your breath on these, but I do want to get to them. So, and then amongst reviewing some Asimov books as well, I think I'll be seeing some of that as well. I think Asimov has endeared with me much more so than Clarke. But my interest in science fiction began with Arthur C. Clarke. And the 2001, it would later come to include Childhood's End, Expedition to Earth. There's some others, and some of it is kind of non-fiction. It's not really fiction. It's not really non-fiction, but it's not fiction either. It's describing how things could be someday when just routine passenger flights to an orbiting space station or a lunar colony, are fairly common and routine, and maybe even trips to Mars might be, a part of life, even if it's like the moon. Well, let's get on to the 2001 as a book specifically. And there's a lot in this book that's really kind of nifty, because it does not, there it is again, just in case, maybe that thing will capture that. It does not follow the movie exactly. In fact, there's a very significant difference between this book and the movie, and for that matter, the movie for the second one, 2010, as well as 2010's book and 2061, although by that point the distinction doesn't really matter anymore. And that has to do with the fact that in that book, unlike every place else, Discovery went to Saturn. So it was kind of neat. You had Dave Bowman and Frank Poole And they were on there for a long time together because they had to go not just to Jupiter, they just used Jupiter's gravity to speed them on the way on out to Saturn. And then they had to go all the way to Saturn. And Saturn was kind of neat in the one sense that there was this one satellite that's literally 6 times brighter on one side of its orbit than the other. And in the story, it's because there's a big white eye-shaped oval kind of a thing with this little tiny thing in the very middle, like a itty bitty pupil. It's actually a monolith right on the surface of that planet. Well, as we know, the way they had it instead is we only go to Jupiter, and the big one, they called it TMA2, which is kind of strange. It's nowhere near the lunar crater Tycho. It's way out in orbit around Jupiter, and they never seem to detect any trace of a magnetic field. So the only part of that still makes any sense is anomaly, which it is obviously a very anomalous alien object. So they get out there, and if you've known the story, and I'm going to assume you probably have some familiarity with the story, then you're aware that they go along as they go along, the computer starts having these weird little things where it's like, just a moment, I've just detected a fault in the AE35 unit, and suddenly they got to go out, bring that thing back in, look at it, find nothing wrong with it, no diagnostic, shows anything wrong with it. And finally, Hal says, well, it's very strange. I find it unusual. Perhaps you should take the unit back and let it fail. We can afford to be out of communication with Earth for the short time it will take to recover the unit and discover what the problem is. And of course, Frank Poole is doing that journey. He gets killed. And suddenly Bowman's on his own. Well, there's the other three. In the book, it's Kaminsky and Whitehead and Hunter. In the movie, for some reason, or maybe vice versa, and it's Kaminsky and Kendall and Hunter. So we don't get to see these people at all. There's just bits of faces sitting inside these things, hibernating, and then they'll never wake up. So that all is the same. So Hal has to be shut down after Dave Bowman, having gone out and run out to get Frank Poole, panic more than anything else. But Frank is dead. The air just bled out of his suit and into space, and breathe. He's dead. So he's brought him back. Now Hal won't let him on board, so he has to come in through the chute inside of the spacecraft, the emergency chute. And that's how he gets in. And he had to do it without his helmet, just like in the movie. Dave, I'm afraid without your helmet, you'll find that extremely difficult. Oh, well, I guess I shouldn't try for it. Of course he's got to do it. He's got it, and he does. So he gets back in, deactivates Hal, and has to do the rest of the journey on his own. Which he does. And he gets back and he finds the other three in hibernation, are now dead, so he won't. So he has to take care of burying them in space, kind of equivalent to burial at sea, I guess. I guess you don't really need to do that with Frank Poole because he was left outside the spacecraft anyway. I don't know if he recovers him or not. So then they get, of course, to the object itself, and after some very careful and cautious explorations, he gets close to it, and suddenly he goes in. Now, one other thing. In the book for 2010 and the movie for 2010, both, it's made clear that the last transmission he gave was, "My God, it's full of stars." But that's not in the movie. It's not even in the book. But that movie has a lot of interesting things. And in fact, it had a lot of what I really liked was a lot of detailed description of the kind of space hardware. All of that was very carefully and meticulously thought out. This kind of spacecraft, how Dr. Floyd goes to the moon, you see, all the stages, the space station, you see, like you see on the cover of the book, with that nice, call it rectangular door that, in fact, you could actually see it kind of not rotating while the rest of it rotates around so that the craft can just fly in and land in there somehow, and then it can start rotating gradually when the spacecraft is docked and mounted itself so it won't have any bad stresses on it. And then you go out on that and go out to the rim of the spacecraft, which is where all the gravity is. So, I mean, all of that. And the next part to the moon and the lunar colony. And then Discovery itself. A very impressive looking ship. That round ball where the people live. And then this long stuff in between, which from the movie it's not clear what's going on. All of that length stuff is a whole bunch of fins for dissipating heat from the reactors, big ones, the back end where the engines are. Maybe there's a small reactor inside the other for powering instrumentation and keeping the lighting up for the people and stuff. But I'm not sure about that. I don't remember that specifically. But at any rate, and it's really, really long because it had to be a long way from the intense radiation of the engines, the nuclear-powered engines that drive this thing all the way to Saturn or Jupiter, depending on which version you're reading. Looking at. So he gets out there, and this thing, and it had that circular thing that rotates inside, sort of like the other space station, but it's really small and it's all contained inside that round ball at the front of it. So there's he gets there, he goes into this whole big transdimensional duct. Apparently is one of the functions of this mysterious I'll say TMA2, although I've already explained why that's not really appropriate. They find it Jupiter or Saturn in one case. So, and the kinds of stuff he experiences in there, and then he comes back to the Star Child, and that's the beginning, which actually echoes, like from foreshadowing the story, that first part with the apes. In the movie, I was kind of watching these apes jumping around and shouting and so forth, and the most I figured out was maybe if they first discover a tool for the first time, picking up a bone and using it to hit something. I find it curious that I think my first essay in world history in high school was about primitive men and their tools. I'm sure it was in some way, the choice of subject was in some ways encouraged by that opening scene. But the whole thing of the one particular monkey, or gorilla, or ape, or proto-humanoid, whatever you want to call these creatures, one of them is the first to touch the little monolith that appeared among them. And all the wisdom, zap, goes into him. He can show the other fellow creatures what he knows, but he learned it directly from that. And he discovers the ability to use a weapon, and it gives him power. He can feed his tribe, he can conquer the other tribe, and that's great. And now it's like, now that he's done that, what is he going to do next? And then the story jumps from there to David Floyd is already on his way to the moon. And one of the best comparisons I once said is that they described the how the progress of science fiction movies, how in the 50s and so forth, and maybe before, if you're just going to the moon, you spend half the movie explaining how to do it, as best as you can guess with 1930s, 40s, or 50s technology. And maybe the other half or less making the actual trip. And here, the envy of all of that was, in 1/24th of a second, you go from a bomb that's thrown in the air to a spacecraft in orbit around the Earth. Bam! 1/24th of a second. And that's always been one of the cool aspects of the movie. And the book, it follows it all that pretty well. And it also explains some stuff. What I picked up is that in the book, you actually do get some hints as to why it was Hal was having a problem. And it takes the next movie for the Dr. Chandler character to sum it up perfectly. Hal was told to lie by people who find it easy to lie. Hal doesn't know how, so he couldn't function. It's one thing I hope to get to. I talk about 2010, both the book and the movie. So the movie, of course, is obviously a very, very major, iconic point. Apparently, even George Lucas was inspired by that, and he wanted to kind of, couldn't build on it, maybe stand on the shoulders of giants at most, with his original Star Wars movies and so forth back in the 1970s and 80s. So it was an inspiration for a lot of people, and it's changed, movie making. But see, you had the movie guy, the his name. Well, you had the novelist Arthur C. Clarke and Stanley Kubrick. I don't remember his name. And they were trying to come up with what they were going to call a proverbial good science fiction movie. Because I guess none of them were good. They were like B movies a lot of times. Even fairly sophisticated ones like Forbidden Planet and so forth. There's some good stuff there. That could make a good Star Trek episode, actually. But on the whole, next to 2001, they're all practically kiddie-lit albums. By comparison, at least, even the best of them. And the worst of them, don't think about those. So, there was a lot of back and forth. Are we going to do this? Are we going to go there? Are we going to try to go to Saturn? In that particular mode, that trick was captured in the book. No, that's too much special effects, and it's going to make the move. It's a long movie. And now it's even longer if by adding a whole additional leg of the journey from Jupiter to Saturn. No. Now confuse audiences and a whole lot of extra special effects. Fortunately, Douglas Trumbull, who was doing the special effects, had worked on making Saturn show up, and he used that effect in another movie, so it wasn't really wasted. So, other than the book, it's just what I'm mostly wanting to comment on, because that's the neat part. They go to Jupiter. But it is neat when they went to Saturn. And so much of the space and the procedure and what you need to do and the things you need to be conscious about when you're doing a spacewalk. And little things like, it's usually when you're kind of done with what you've gone out to do, and all you need to do is now just kind of pack everything up and get back home or into your spaceship, as the case may be here, and your little extravehicular activity, EVA, and that's usually the time where mistakes are made, and that's a good point, and probably applies to a lot of things besides extravehicular activities in outer space. But little things like that, and there's a lot of the procedural, which, as a young kid reading it, and who had loved seeing these beautiful spaceships floating through space and so forth, I just absolutely jazzed on that. Looking at it now, I still like that the best. But obviously, you want more of this story, and surprisingly little of the book is about what did he see. But he saw some stuff. and what does it mean to be the Star Child. Well, someday I hope to get to the second one. I don't hold your breath, but at some point I do hope to get to the second one, and 2010, with again some comment on its movie because I was thrilled to see that, and I do in fact like that movie too. But then there was the third, which I don't know. I think it was a bit of a disappointment. I haven't read the fourth, so we will see. But right now, that's 2001. I've certainly enjoyed it. My whole interest in reading science fiction started with 2001. We had that book. I read it. I loved all that in there. There is one other book I recommend. I don't have it with me right now to hold up, and it's called The Lost Worlds of 2001. If you can find it, do so. I don't know if it's in print, but maybe you use bookstores, eBay, or for Lost Worlds of 2001. Definitely worth looking for. You read all the different ways the story was constantly growing and changing. Things were added and subtracted in the development of the movie, and the book, which kind of explains some of the differences between the two and some of the background stuff. And in some of these bits that had been written and then thrown away, you actually get to find out who were Kaminsky and Hunter and Whitehead or Kendall, or Kimball, whatever, Kendall, Kimball, you know, depending upon which version. Who are these guys and what were they like? Because in some earlier drafts of the book, they do get revived, and they're all kind of working together to explore very carefully and gradually this extraordinary, well, TNA2. We find out it's Saturn. And that was really neat. In fact, I think that book contains the absolute best explanation of a transdimensional duct I've ever seen. We tried it in the Tesseract of A Wrinkle in Time. They actually did it in the 2001 book, but it still didn't really quite capture that. The Lost Worlds of 2001 explained that concept really well. I have a review of a Wrinkle in Time movie. I think I present The Lost World here, or at least I quote from it. But anyway, so that's one other thing I would recommend in trying to understand what there was about the movie, to know how it came about and how things happened. It's really great. It's better than the making of kind of stuff. All that could be of interest too. How he did the special effects. I always like to know those things. But seeing how the story grew and changed, especially as you kind of had the author, Arthur C. Clarke, and the movie director, producer, Stanley Kubrick. And they were kind of going like this, pulling in different directions all the time. But it still ended up in something astonishingly creative. And like I said, it's an absolute landmark, and rightly so. I think I've said enough about this movie and the book, especially the book, because I wanted to focus on that. But I can't help but bring the other in as well as I go. So, thanks for listening. It's been a while, and it's good to be back.